Silence is one of the most underestimated forces in human interaction. Many people believe communication is built through words, explanations, and emotional expression. Yet the truth is that silence often carries a far more accurate message than anything spoken aloud. When everything becomes noisy, when emotions, expectations, and misunderstandings pile on top of each other, noise creates confusion. But silence in its simplicity reveals what noise works very hard to distort. It exposes intentions, reveals truths, and uncovers motives that chatter tries to disguise. Noise has a way of filling space with distraction. People talk to convince, to defend, to explain themselves into a version of truth they hope others will accept. They speak to avoid responsibility, to hide their insecurities, or to mask the parts of themselves they cannot face. In the noise, it becomes difficult to see what is real. Words can be shaped, arguments can be rehearsed, emotions can be exaggerated or minimized, but silence has no performance. Silence cannot be manipulated. It acts like a clear mirror, reflecting exactly what is present without distortion. When you fall quiet, not out of anger, not to punish, but simply to reconnect with your own center, something powerful begins to shift. The silence surrounding you becomes a space where truth rises to the surface. Not because you force it, but because silence removes all the places where falsehoods can hide. When you stop speaking, stop arguing, stop trying to make someone understand, you give the situation a chance to reveal itself. What remains in the absence of your effort is what was real all along. Noise hides intentions. Silence reveals them. There are people who thrive in noise because noise gives them room to maneuver. As long as there is constant talking, constant emotional exchange, constant reaction, they can avoid showing what lies beneath the surface. They can use the flow of conversation to redirect, to dodge, to confuse, to delay anything that would require genuine confrontation with themselves. But when the noise stops, when you decide to no longer participate in the cycle, everything they depended on disappears. In that stillness, their truth stands alone. It becomes clear whether their connection with you was built on genuine care or simply on convenience. Silence also reveals to you what noise prevents you from hearing. When emotions run high, the mind becomes clouded. You may find yourself trapped in overthinking, replaying conversations, explaining yourself again and again, trying to make sense of someone's behavior. But once you step into silence, your inner world reorganizes. The confusion dissolves and deeper understanding begins to take form. You start to notice patterns you ignored. You recognize emotional imbalances you tolerated. You become aware of the ways you were overextending yourself, trying to keep something alive that wasn't being reciprocated with the same energy. It is in silence that your intuition speaks the loudest. Noise dilutes intuition, silence sharpens it. What you couldn't understand while tangled in someone else's words becomes obvious when you step back. Silence gives you perspective. It allows you to see not only the other person's intentions, but also your own needs, your own boundaries, and your own truth. Noise pulls you outward. Silence brings you inward. And inward is where the real answers reside. In relationships, silence becomes a powerful teacher. When you withdraw your emotional energy and stop filling the space with your presence, you give the other person room to show you who they really are. Some people, when met with silence, step forward. They clarify, they reach out, they show effort. The absence of noise reveals their sincerity. Others disappear into the emptiness, not because they don't care, but because the relationship only existed through your effort. Silence reveals that too. Silence exposes the imbalance that noise was hiding. Stillness has a way of revealing dependency as well. When you stop giving, you see who was giving in return. When you stop initiating, you see who initiates back. When you stop explaining, you see who seeks understanding. Noise makes it easy for one person to carry the entire weight of a connection. Silence reveals whether the connection can stand on its own. It is not silence that causes someone to drift away. It is silence that uncovers the truth that they were never anchored in the first place. There is also a deeper psychological layer to why silence reveals so much. Human beings are uncomfortable with stillness because stillness confronts them with themselves. In noise, they can escape, they can argue, distract, deflect, or justify. But silence removes these escape routes. In your absence, a person must sit with their own mind, their own emptiness, their own longing, or their own avoidance. If they miss you, silence amplifies that feeling. If they took you for granted, silence forces them to feel the loss. If they were only participating in the relationship because of what you provided, silence exposes their lack of contribution. And for you, silence uncovers the emotional truth you were too busy to see. You may discover that your heart was trying too hard, that your energy was going towards someone who didn't know how to value it. Or you may discover the opposite, that your silence shows you how deeply someone cares, how quickly they notice your withdrawal, how sincerely they step forward when the noise disappears. Either way, silence brings truth to the surface. Noise tries to hide emotional imbalances, unresolved issues, and unspoken fears. It creates movement without progress, sound without meaning, presence without connection. But silence cuts through all illusions and brings everything back to its pure form. It reveals who is aligned with you and who is only aligned with the noise. It shows you the reality beneath the surface, the intentions that could not survive quietness, and the truths that had been waiting to be seen all along. Distance is often misunderstood. Many see it as separation, loss, or disconnection, but in truth, distance is one of the most powerful catalysts for awareness. When two people step back from each other, whether by choice, by circumstance, or by emotional exhaustion, something profound begins to happen beneath the surface. In closeness, the mind becomes accustomed to what is constant, presence becomes routine, and routine slowly numbs perception. But when distance appears, the senses awaken. What was once overlooked becomes suddenly visible. What was taken for granted rises into sharp clarity. Distance pulls you out of emotional noise and allows you to see the reality of a connection without the fog of proximity. When you are too close to something, you cannot see it clearly. The emotional lens distorts, the habitual patterns blur your vision, and the familiarity makes you blind to the subtle shifts happening between you and another. But the moment space is introduced, the picture becomes clearer. The mind, which had been operating on autopilot, begins to notice what it previously ignored. This awareness does not happen immediately. At first, distance can feel uncomfortable. It triggers the mind to search for what is missing, to scan the empty space left behind, trying to understand the shift. But as the emotional waves settle, deeper clarity emerges. You begin to see the relationship without the influence of expectation or attachment. You start to perceive the truth of the dynamic. Not what you hoped it was, not what you convinced yourself it could be, but what it actually was all along. Distance reveals reality by removing the illusions created by constant interaction. For the other person, distance becomes an unexpected mirror. When you withdraw your presence, your energy, your constant availability, they confront a silence they did not prepare for. In that silence, their awareness begins to grow. They start to feel the space where your presence used to live. They begin to notice the small things. They miss the tone of your voice, the consistency of your messages, the softness of your concern, the attention you gave without hesitation. What they once received effortlessly now becomes a noticeable absence. Distance forces them into a kind of inner inventory. They begin to examine what role you played in their emotional landscape. They become aware of what they lost access to. Your support, your warmth, your stability, your understanding. When you were close, they didn't truly see the magnitude of your presence. But when space opens, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Human beings often recognize value through absence more than presence, because the mind only wakes up when the heart feels the shift. On your side, distance grants you a renewed perspective of yourself. It shows you where you gave too much, where you accepted too little, where you ignored your inner voice in the pursuit of connection. Distance gives you time to understand your own patterns. You realize whether you were acting from genuine love or from emotional habit. You notice whether the relationship nurtured you or drained you. These insights rarely come when you are entangled in constant interaction. Clarity requires space. Awareness requires silence. Inner truth requires the breadth of distance. Distance also reveals the intentions of the other person with striking accuracy. When you step back, you see who moves forward. You see who notices, who cares, who makes an effort to bridge the gap. The one who feels your absence will try to close the distance. The one who only valued convenience will fade into the background. Distance exposes alignment. It shows you who is emotionally connected and who was merely enjoying the benefits of your presence without offering anything substantial in return. Awareness born from distance is not just emotional, it is energetic. When you are no longer pouring energy into someone, you start to feel how much energy you were giving. You notice the weight lifted from your mind. You recognize how much peace returns when you stop trying to maintain a connection that was one-sided. You begin to feel your own presence again, the part of you that gets lost when you are constantly giving to someone who does not reciprocate with equal sincerity. Distance also teaches discipline. It reminds you that stepping back is sometimes the only way to see forward. When emotions run high, when confusion grows, when the situation feels tangled, distance is the reset button. It allows you to detach from the immediate emotional reaction and reconnect with your deeper wisdom. It gives the heart room to breathe, and with that breath comes understanding. The awareness that grows in distance is not always comfortable, but it is always truthful. You may realize someone was not as committed as you believed, or you may realize they cared far more than their words revealed. You may see that you loved from a place of insecurity, or that they loved from a place of fear. Distance exposes the quality of the bond with stunning clarity, and as this awareness grows, you begin to understand one of the quiet truths of human connection. Closeness is not what reveals someone's heart. Distance is. Anyone can behave a certain way when comfort is present, when attention is abundant, when communication is constant. But distance shows who truly values connection, who is willing to reach across the space, and who recognizes the significance of what they are losing. Through distance, both hearts see more clearly, both minds understand more deeply, and both energies reveal their true nature, unfiltered, unpressured, unmasked by the noise of daily interaction. Your presence, when given consistently, has a way of slipping beneath the surface of another person's awareness. What begins as something meaningful, something noticed, something appreciated, gradually becomes part of the background of their emotional world. Not because it loses value, but because the human mind grows accustomed to what is steady. What is reliable becomes invisible. What is always available becomes unconscious. And without realizing it, the other person begins to experience your presence not as a gift, but as a natural part of their environment. Something assumed, something expected, something that simply exists without effort. This unconscious familiarity happens slowly. At first, your messages bring warmth. Your presence feels like comfort. Your attention holds meaning. But over time, without balance, without mutual effort, without acknowledgement, the emotional mind shifts into a state of passive receiving. Your care becomes a routine for them, a kind of emotional background noise that they stop consciously appreciating. They do not notice the consistency you maintain. They do not register the gentle offerings of affection and understanding you extend. They simply adapt to it, the way one adapts to sunlight in the morning or the sound of a flowing river. Beautiful, necessary, but so constant that one forgets to marvel at it. This is not always intentional. Most people do not consciously choose to take someone for granted. It is simply the way the mind works. Familiarity breeds comfort, but comfort often dulls awareness. When you show up every time they need you, their nervous system begins to rely on you without recognizing the depth of what you provide. Your presence becomes so steady that they stop questioning whether it will be there tomorrow. They stop wondering what life would feel like without your warmth, your guidance, your emotional consistency. In their eyes, you become a certainty. And certainty, when unexamined, becomes invisible. Your presence becomes unconscious because you have been giving without asking, staying without being acknowledged, showing up without requiring recognition. You become the stable ground on which they stand, and the mind rarely contemplates the ground. It only notices when the ground shifts, when the solid earth suddenly feels different, when what was once effortless becomes uncertain. The moment you step back, the moment your energy recedes even slightly, their awareness snaps awake. What was unconscious becomes sharply conscious. Human beings only realize the true weight of something when it is no longer guaranteed. While you were consistently there, they did not realize you were carrying emotional weight for both of you. They did not notice that your presence was filling a space in their life, soothing insecurities, providing comfort, creating connection. But once you pull back, once you stop initiating, stop overgiving, stop pouring your energy into a one-sided dynamic, the absence reveals what the presence hid. Suddenly, they notice the silence. Suddenly, they notice the shift in energy. Suddenly, they feel a gap they cannot easily explain. Your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was, Not because you changed, but because distance restores awareness. When someone becomes accustomed to something, they lose the ability to perceive its value clearly. But when that familiarity is interrupted, the mind is forced to reassess. They begin to remember the small things you provided. The emotional security, the sense of being understood, the feeling of being cared for in a way that did not demand anything in return. They realize the reassurance that came from knowing you were there. They recognize the comfort they experienced without acknowledging it. Your presence had become unconscious because you were holding more than your share of emotional responsibility. You were the consistent one. You were the one who made things easier. You were the one who adjusted, who listened, who softened the hard edges of every conversation. And when that presence becomes a constant, it becomes invisible, not less valuable, just less noticed. But the moment you reclaim your energy, the moment you shift from constant presence to intentional presence, awareness returns. They begin to see the difference between having you and not having you. They begin to understand what your presence actually meant beyond the surface level interactions. They become aware of how deeply your warmth shaped their emotional landscape. This is one of the paradoxes of human connection. The more consistently you give, the more invisible your giving becomes. The more reliable you are, the less your reliability is consciously felt. The more available you remain, the less your availability is recognized as a choice. And this is why stepping back is not abandonment. It is clarity. It is the restoration of balance. It is the opportunity for the other person to reawaken to what they could no longer see. Your presence becoming unconscious does not mean it was unimportant. It means it was powerful enough to become part of their internal world, familiar enough to feel natural, steady enough to be absorbed into their emotional environment. But awareness must be maintained, and awareness only returns through contrast. By stepping into distance, you allow the truth to rise again. You allow the other person to feel the space where your presence once moved, and in that space, they finally remember what they had forgotten to notice, what they had become blind to, and what they assumed would always remain without effort. Stillness is not simply the absence of movement, it is the environment in which hidden truths finally rise. When you step back, when you become quiet, when you stop pouring your energy towards someone who has grown comfortable receiving it, a profound psychological shift takes place. Your stillness becomes a mirror, and whether he is ready or not, he must face the reflection staring back at him. It is in this quiet space, free from your explanations, free from your reassurance, free from your emotional presence, that he begins to meet himself honestly. As long as you are speaking, guiding, comforting, or engaging, he has something to lean on. Your energy becomes a cushion that protects him from confronting his own behavior, his own patterns, and his own internal contradictions. Your presence fills the emotional gaps within him, allowing him to avoid the discomfort of looking inward. Many men do not realize how much they rely on someone else's emotional stability until that stability withdraws. Your stillness becomes a kind of interruption to his unconscious habits. It halts the automatic patterns he has been following, patterns of taking you for granted, patterns of assuming you will always be there, patterns of avoiding emotional accountability. When you become still, he no longer has your reactions to distract him. He no longer has your attention to regulate his emotions. He no longer has your effort to cover the areas where he should have been contributing. Without your movement, he must sit with his own. Without your words, he must hear the sound of his thoughts. Without your presence, he is left with a space he does not know how to fill. This is where self-reflection begins, not by choice, but by necessity. Stillness forces him to question himself in ways he avoided when the connection was active. He begins to wonder why you pulled back, why the dynamic shifted, why the flow of communication stopped. At first, his mind may resist the truth, searching for external explanations or blaming circumstances. But stillness has a way of stripping away excuses. The longer the silence continues, the more undeniable the internal questions become. He starts to examine the parts of himself he ignored, the contradictions in his behavior, the inconsistencies in his intentions, the emotional hesitations he tried to hide. In the past, he could mask these things with noise. He could rely on your emotional presence to stabilize the connection. He could rely on your persistence to keep the bond alive. But when you step back into stillness, the imbalance reveals itself. He cannot avoid the realization that he left too much of the emotional work to you. He cannot avoid noticing how passive he had become. He cannot avoid seeing that the connection was sustained not by equal effort, but by your strength. And this realization does not arrive through confrontation. It arrives through emptiness. Stillness becomes the teacher that noise never could be. It forces him to sit with the discomfort of his own inaction. It brings forward the guilt he suppressed when he dismissed your needs. It awakens the regret he didn't feel fully while you were still giving. In the quiet, he begins to hear the echo of his choices. The moments he ignored you, the times he dismissed your concerns, the opportunities he had to show up but didn't. Stillness amplifies these memories not to punish him, but to reveal what was hidden under the noise of daily interaction. He begins to recognize the emotional labor you were providing without acknowledgement. He realizes that your care was not automatic, it was intentional. Your presence was not a guarantee, it was a gift. Your consistency was not his right, it was your effort. And with each day of distance, these truths become louder. Stillness transforms into awareness. Awareness transforms into self-reflection. Self-reflection transforms into a kind of internal accountability that he never reached when everything felt easy and familiar. Stillness also confronts him with the emotional consequences of his choices. When you were present, he did not fully feel the impact of his behavior because your presence softened it. But in your silence, the consequences become unavoidable. He feels the absence of your energy as a weight. He feels the loss of your warmth as a coldness inside his own mind. He feels the emptiness where your presence used to be, and that emptiness forces him to question what he truly wants and what he is willing to lose. He begins to see himself more clearly, not because you explained anything, but because stillness removes the layers he used to hide behind. Without movement, he cannot distract himself. Without you regulating the emotional tone, he must regulate his own. Without your constant effort, he must confront the parts of himself he neglected. Stillness becomes a turning point where he realizes that if he wants connection, he must contribute to it. If he wants your presence, he must value it. If he wants to be understood, he must communicate. And slowly, he begins to awaken. He starts to examine the deeper questions he never asked himself. Why did he pull away? Why did he hesitate? Why did he become distant? Why did he allow the connection to weaken? Stillness drives him inward, into the corners of his own emotional world. It brings him face to face with insecurities he avoided, fears he never named, patterns he never resolved. In the silence, he meets the truth of who he is and what he risks losing. He begins to understand that your stillness is not an absence. It is an invitation to recognize what he failed to see. It is a space that reveals his own inner landscape, his own emotional gaps, his own longing that he never acknowledged when everything felt safe and familiar. Silence has a natural intelligence of its own. It does not need to argue, confront, or demand in order to restore balance. It simply removes excess energy, allowing what is uneven, unconscious, or misaligned to reveal itself. When you go silent, not in anger, not as manipulation, but as a return to your own center, you withdraw the emotional fuel that was sustaining an imbalance between you and another person. Silence becomes a reset, a stabilizing force that restores what words and effort could not. Energetic imbalance forms when one person gives more than they receive, when they carry both sides of the emotional weight, when they initiate every conversation, soothe every conflict, or consistently show up while the other remains passive. Over time, this imbalance becomes normalized. The giver becomes accustomed to giving. The receiver becomes accustomed to receiving. The dynamic becomes a pattern, one that both parties unconsciously reinforce. But patterns built on imbalance cannot sustain themselves. They exhaust the giver, weaken the connection, and block the possibility of mutual growth. This is where silence steps in. Silence interrupts energetic habits. It removes the constant flow of energy from your side. Instead of giving, you pause. Instead of explaining, you breathe. Instead of filling space, you reclaim your own. In doing so, the imbalance becomes visible because silence removes the illusion that everything is fine. When you stop carrying the weight, the energy that was once invisible becomes impossible to ignore. For the other person, silence is like removing the air from a room. They suddenly feel the absence of what your presence had been providing. Attention, warmth, reassurance, continuity. When you were active, your energy covered the gaps they refused to acknowledge. They didn't have to step toward you because you were already stepping toward them. They didn't have to give emotionally because you were supplying more than enough for both. But when you become silent, when your energy retreats inward, they are left with the responsibility they had been avoiding. Silence forces them to confront the imbalance in a way that conversation never could. Silence also resets your own internal energy. When you are constantly giving, you lose awareness of how drained you have become. You begin to feel responsible for maintaining the connection, even if it means sacrificing your own emotional well-being. Overgiving becomes a habit, and habits become identity. But silence breaks that pattern. It gives your nervous system the chance to recalibrate. It allows you to feel your own emotions without the influence of someone else's needs. It helps you recover the energy you lost through constant giving. In this stillness, your intuition awakens. You start to notice what your body had been trying to tell you for a long time, that you were carrying too much, pushing too hard, giving too deeply without receiving enough in return. Silence gives you space to observe the dynamics with clarity rather than emotional urgency. It reveals who reaches out when you stop trying. It shows you whose effort increases when yours decreases. It exposes who was dependent on your energy and who is capable of giving their own. Energetic imbalance cannot survive silence because it depends on movement, on interaction, on one person continuously offering what the other does not reciprocate. When the giving stops, the dynamic collapses into its true form. This is why silence often triggers unexpected reactions. He may suddenly chase when he once ignored. He may reach out when he was previously careless. He may reflect deeply when he once avoided emotional honesty. Your silence forces him to meet the space he used to take for granted. In the quiet, he begins to feel the weight you had been carrying. He becomes aware of how much effort you consistently provided. He realizes the emotional stability you offered was not automatic. It was a contribution. When he no longer has access to that steady energy, he must either step forward or allow the connection to reveal his lack of effort. Silence makes the imbalance undeniable. Silence also gives him room to activate his own energy. When you are constantly giving, he becomes passive. Not always out of selfishness, but because your energy fills the space so completely that he never has the opportunity or necessity to contribute. But when you go silent, when your attention is no longer the driving force, he must finally decide whether the connection matters enough for him to invest. Silence removes the emotional crutches he relied on. It challenges him to rise into effort, intention, and responsibility. This is how silence restores balance. It does not push him. It does not pull him. It does not force or manipulate. It simply creates space. In that space, energy reorganizes itself. What is meant to return will return with clarity. What is not aligned will fall away. Silence becomes a filter that separates genuine connection from attachment, habit, or convenience. Through silence, you also rediscover your own equilibrium. You reconnect with your own needs, boundaries, and emotional truth. You begin to feel the difference between giving from love and giving from fear. You recognize the ways you try to maintain harmony at the cost of your own peace. And as the imbalance dissolves, you regain your sense of self. Your energy begins to rise. You become stronger, clearer, more grounded. Silence resets the dynamic not by changing him, but by changing the flow of energy between you. It removes what was excessive. It reveals what was missing. It brings the connection back to truth, allowing both individuals to meet each other on equal ground rather than through emotional distortion. Absence has a language of its own, one that speaks not in syllables but in space, silence, and energy. While words can explain, argue, justify, or plead, they often fail to convey the depth of feeling, the weight of presence, or the subtle truth of your influence in someone's life. Words are easily ignored, misinterpreted, or dismissed, but absence cannot be bypassed. When you step back, when you remove yourself from the constant rhythm of attention, conversation, or emotional availability, something remarkable occurs. The lessons that were invisible within dialogue become visible within emptiness. Your absence becomes a teacher that no explanation could match. Humans are wired to feel what is missing. We notice gaps more than we notice what has always been present. When you are constantly present, your energy becomes normalized. Your efforts, your care, your emotional investment, no matter how profound, start to blend into the background. They are assumed, expected, or taken for granted. The person receiving your attention does not actively measure or recognize it because the consistency masks its value. Words, no matter how heartfelt, rarely have the ability to undo this unconsciousness. They explain, but they cannot manifest presence. They describe, but they cannot replace lived experience. Absence, however, speaks in a way that is immediate, undeniable, and visceral. Your absence forces reflection in ways words never could. When someone suddenly notices that the constant comfort, attention, and energy they relied on is no longer available, they are confronted with reality. They feel what they had ignored. They recognize the space your presence occupied, not in terms of location or actions alone, but in the emotional and energetic landscape of their life. It is only when the warmth, consistency, and attention are withdrawn that the mind wakes up to the magnitude of what it had taken for granted. Absence illuminates truth by contrast, revealing the richness of what was once so familiar that it went unnoticed. This revelation is not always comfortable. In fact, it often feels like a void at first. Emptiness has a way of confronting us with all the things we tried to ignore. We begin to feel the lack of someone's guidance, the absence of someone's reassurance, the missing energy that once shaped the emotional atmosphere around us. It forces a reckoning. Without your presence, without your influence, without your engagement. How does the person experience the world differently? How do they experience themselves differently? The absence does not lie. It exposes avoidance, indifference, or neglect. It highlights the ways they relied on your presence without gratitude, the ways they underestimated your role, the ways they only realized your value when it was no longer guaranteed. Absence is also a mirror for the other person's actions. Words can be politely ignored, dismissed, or rationalized away, but absence cannot be reasoned around. When your attention, your effort, and your energy are no longer available, the space you leave behind demands a response. It forces him to consider his own behavior. Was he fully present when you were there? Did he appreciate the consistency of your care? Did he understand the depth of your influence? Or did he assume it was infinite, automatic, or unearned? Absence does not allow for evasion. It exposes patterns in the clearest way. From your side, absence is a reclaiming of power and clarity. When you step back, you are no longer trapped in trying to explain your value through words or gestures. You allow the reality of the dynamic to surface without your influence masking it. You create space for truth to emerge, and in that space, both parties see the unvarnished reality of the connection. Absence does not manipulate. It simply provides the conditions under which awareness can grow. It creates a pause in which reflection, insight, and understanding are possible. This teaching works on multiple levels. On the emotional level, absence forces the person to feel the gap you leave behind, the loss of your energy, your warmth, your guidance. On the psychological level, it awakens recognition of patterns and habits that went unnoticed while you were present. On the energetic level, it recalibrates the dynamic, revealing where dependence, imbalance, or neglect existed. In each of these ways, absence conveys lessons that words alone cannot: the importance of respect, the value of consistent care, the consequences of taking someone for granted, and the need to meet others with reciprocity and presence. Absence also allows internal reflection to occur in ways conversation cannot achieve. When someone is constantly interacting with you, responding to your words, and engaging with your energy, they may feel compelled to react outwardly rather than look inward. They may address surface issues without examining the deeper truths of their behavior, intentions, and emotional investment. But when you remove yourself, the external stimulus disappears and introspection becomes inevitable. They are left with the silent question: what did I truly have, and what did I do with it? Furthermore, absence teaches boundaries and self-respect in subtle, unavoidable ways. It demonstrates that connection is not infinite, that attention cannot be taken for granted, and that your presence is a choice, not a given. Words can ask for recognition, absence forces recognition. Words can plead for change, absence demands it. Words can instruct understanding, absence cultivates it experientially. In this sense, absence is the embodiment of lessons that the mind may ignore when distracted by engagement or habitual interaction. Your absence, therefore, becomes a form of communication more powerful than explanation. It communicates worth, value, expectation, and reflection without uttering a single word. It allows the other person to feel the weight of what was once present but overlooked. It forces recognition where conversation failed. It creates a space where truth, awareness, and accountability can arise naturally, guided not by persuasion but by experience.